God in our own poverty, or like reach out to God and to relax in God's hand. So kind of, it's about God and we do less in a sense. That's the idea. It's like having less of it. It's a bit to have less of it more.
I'm supposed to be talking about the vulnerability of God, so I'll try to interpret that my own way, if that's okay. So I'll start with a bit of a story from history. In June of 1971, 1791, I got the numbers wrong, 1791, so this is in the 18th century. It was a very tempestuous time in France. At the time, the economy was a mess, the people were discontented, the rich people were trampling on the poor people were very upset. So there was a revolution in France. And the local people took over the government. And so during this revolution at the beginning, it wasn't very violent to begin with. And they wanted to get rid of their king. And so the king in this time, King Louis XVI, his power was getting less and less. Okay, he was losing more and more power, and he was getting agitated by this, and he was trying to do things behind the scenes to get his power back, but he couldn't get much of it back. And so as he was doing this, he was realizing the situation is becoming more and more hopeless for him, more and more hopeless to ever become a powerful monarch again. And so he decided to take his wife, Marie Antoinette, and their kids and escape France, okay? And to do that, and because he was under a kind of house arrest, he decided to disguise himself. So he was dressed as a commoner, his wife was dressed as a commoner, kids were dressed as, peasants from the street, even his bodyguards, everyone was dressed down. Everyone was dressed to look like nothing. And as long as they were dressed like nothing, they were able to get through the crowds, to get through the dangers, and get their way out of France. As they got further and further away from Paris, the king started to feel comfortable and say to himself, well, looks like we're out of danger, should be all right. So he gets out and he starts talking to the people, starts, just chatting, and some people start to recognize him. Oh, this is the king. But they're not sure. And then just before he exited France, they finally got one of the magistrates to come and check on this vehicle and this car and say, looks like there's someone pretty important in this vehicle. So the magistrate comes and he examines them, and as soon as he sees King Louis, he drops on his knee, my king, and he kisses his ring and his hand and does the whole thing. Of course, what happened then is that King Louis got arrested, he got sent back to Paris, and eventually got beheaded. And so what's my point in this story is that as long as he was unseen, as long as he was dressed as a commoner, as long as he was a nobody, then he was safe. The second that he was honored, the second he saw honor, the second he got complacent and went out and wanted to show himself to the people as the king, he lost everything and his honor was stripped from him. There's another scene in a book called The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. If any of you have read it, it's about heaven. It just gives this image of heaven and hell in this book. And the book is mainly set in heaven, and as these people who have problems the angels are trying to convince them to let go of their problems and make their way towards God. And so, as these people are trying to make their way towards God, the angels can come to a certain point to bring them. And then one of the people is asking, where's hell? And the hell is on the other side, and people can come from hell up into heaven. And so one of the souls says to the angel, he says, why can't someone go down into hell to warn them? Why can't anyone go in there and warn them? You know, the angels can come up to this point. Why can't they go in there and warn them? Because they need the warning. And then they ask, where's hell anyway? And then so the guide points to a little tiny crack in the ground. Heaven is huge and hell is this tiny little crack. And so they say, why can't anyone go in there and help them? And the guide says, no. Only the greatest can make himself small enough to go through that crack. No one else can go through that crack. No one else who is less than the greatest can be that small. So what's C.S. Lewis trying to say in that scene? You know, who's the greatest, by the way? Christ. And who is the one that went into hell to take the souls out? It's Christ. That's what he's trying to say in that scene. And what he's saying is that actually the symbol of the glory of God, the power of God, is in his capacity to be nothing, to make himself nothing. The fact that he can make himself so small. That's my interpretation of the vulnerability of God. He's not vulnerable, but he makes himself vulnerable. He allows himself to be the smallest so that he can lift us up. That is the glory of God. All the glory of God comes in this concept that he makes himself into nothing. So the greatest is able to be the smallest. You know, before we continue, the goal of any of us who serve God, the goal is to be as small as we can, to try to compare to the glory of God. We must be, and so I guess my interpretation of the vulnerability of God is that it's about humility. It's about humility, and that is where the glory of God rests. It rests in his humility. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. To be hidden, to be humble, and that's where God is. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about any of this so far before we continue? Okay, so it's important to understand that humility is not something that is, yeah.
So, you know, we kind of want respect and demand respect sometimes. Would Jesus do that?
Demand respect.
Yeah.
So, did he? So the question is that sometimes we like to be respected. Would Jesus do that? Did Jesus at any point in his life demand to be dignified?
Well, it does say which
No, he doesn't. You know, Jesus during his life, he was humiliated at every step. He did things that were considered unclean and dirty. He spent his life amongst sinners, disrespectable people. He chose around him disciples that were not amongst the higher echelons of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, even though lots of them actually followed his teachings. He chose lesser people. He touched lepers, and that's considered unclean and dirty and disgusting. And so actually, no, he didn't. He was never about his own personal dignity. Never. He's about the glory of God, yes, but not about his own personal dignity. Yeah.
So then, in the Gospel of John, like his prayer in the garden, wasn't like speaking to the Father, saying like, glorify me, glorify your name.
Glorify me as, and I'll glorify them. And he does pray that. But what was the ultimate glory? So John's Gospel is a Gospel of science, and that's the first part of Gospel of John, and then the second part is called the Gospel of Glory. What's the glory? The cross. The cross, the greatest symbol of humiliation in the Roman Empire, is his glory. And that's why he says, I will be raised up and I'll call the world to myself, and all these, the language that he uses. So actually the symbol of his power and glory was the cross, is the humiliation of the cross. So look, without going into specifics, yes, sometimes as I serve God, I become one of God's people. I walk down the walkway of humility. I'm not looking after my own dignity. Will I lose some things? Maybe. But we'll see as we go through this that actually what will happen is that you may lose some things along your way, or seemingly lose some things along your way, but you'll always be glorified by God. You'll always be honored by God. So Jesus was glorified by God, definitely. He was honored by God. And you have some really big scenes, like the Transfiguration, the baptism. You have the Epiphany scene, where God is, the best is the Transfiguration scene, where Peter's in flustered mode. He sees this light and this dove and the cloud and the voice. And he said, it's good for us to be here. We're going to build 3 altars. One for Moses, one for Elijah, one for Jesus. And then the voice comes and points at Jesus and says, this is my beloved son. So God is glorifying Jesus above Moses and Elijah. So he was glorified by God, definitely. But was this something that dignified him in front of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? No, he had a crown of thorns. He had he was quiet as they humiliated him. They spat on him. They did all the dirtiest things to him. More than likely naked on the cross. So he was humiliated, no question about it. But that doesn't mean he wasn't glorified by God. There's a big difference. To be dishonored by men is very different to being glorified by God. And also to be dishonored by God is a terrible thing. So we'll talk about that a little bit, about what God does with the people that are humble. Because he does specifically choose them. He does specifically work through them, specifically. And so even if they lose, they gain much more. And the gain is incomparable to the loss. They're two different things. It's like trying to trade money for dirt. There's no comparison between the two, the trade-off, if that makes sense. Any other questions? All right, so it's important to understand that we've already talked about this, and we mentioned it during the workshop, that when Elijah was miserable and all that kind of stuff, he did interact with God. And God decided to reveal himself in a very particular way. Does anyone remember? I said it during the workshop. There's a very particular way that God revealed himself in that scene. Yeah. Yeah, still small voice, right? He chose the still small voice, and he decided to compare that to earthquakes and fires and winds and storms. Why? Because he wanted to say, I am humble and lowly of heart. He said about himself, he's humble and lowly of heart. I am meek, and the blessed will be the meek. So he decided to reveal himself as meek, as gentle, as lowly, as one who is not loud and boisterous and aggressive, but as someone who is humble and lowly. It's also important to understand before we move on that humility is not necessarily just quietness, put my head down, I don't talk to anyone, I'm shy. Because shy is just a personality trait. It's not necessarily humble. What's the best example of that? That someone who's shy, it's a biblical example, is not necessarily correct. Ahab? No? I think he's pretty confident, that guy. What's an example where someone is a bit shy and God gets cranky and says, no, it's not good enough? Yeah. So explain to us Jeremiah's example. It wasn't the one I was thinking about, but yes. Yeah, I'm a kid. Don't send me. Yeah, okay. There's another example. There's other examples. Yeah, where? Yeah, I'm weak in the tongue. What do you mean? Can't be me. And God says, it's enough. It's enough. I'm going to show you a miracle. He showed him a miracle. And Moses still complaining. He says, it's enough. That's not humility. That's not what I want to see. I've sent you. That's what you're going to do. You know? But having said that, later on, Moses is acknowledged as one of the most humble. And what's the actions that he does later on that makes him that humble, that God considers so meek? And does anyone know? So in that scene, he says, "No, I don't like the way you're behaving right now, Moses. That's not humility." But later on, he does. Yeah, he doesn't defend himself when his brother and sister attack him. He says, he wants to be amongst the people. He's one of them. So he actually, it's not about him putting himself down. It's that he doesn't dignify himself. He lets God dignify him. So Moses is a good example where it's not just being shy. The shyness in Moses is not what God considered humble. It was the inner nature of Moses that God considered humble. So I wanted to think a little bit about, and this is what I want to focus on just a little bit, is some of the characteristics of humility in a person's life. And I want to focus on one particular characteristic which we talked about in the workshop. So it's a good segue into this. One of the signs of humility, or one of the things that's necessary for humility, is this idea of contentment. To be content. To be accepting of the things that God has given me. That's part of your journey in humility. For example, John the Baptist says, "A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven." You know, so everything that we have, if we're in God's hands, is acceptable to God, and He will use it for good for us, and we have to learn to understand that. So I want to think a little bit about contentment and how it is that we can be content, or what we need to learn during our life to be content, because it's part of your journey of humility. It needs meekness, humility to accept reality, and it needs meekness to be able to learn from every reality that I live within. Does that make sense? So the first is, and this is from the Bible, from 1 Timothy, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." So the first reason why you should be content is, and you should remember that you came with nothing, and you're going to leave with nothing. And you have to remember that lesson. It's part of your journey, is that you have nothing, you're going to leave with nothing. So why am I demanding more? On what basis am I demanding more from God or from this world or from the people around me? From my friends, from my husband, from my wife, from my children? On what basis am I so demanding? When I came with nothing, I'm going to leave with nothing. You know, so it's important for us to understand this, that he says you have to be, part of being godly is being content, to be able to accept either nothing or a lot. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But we have to learn that we came with nothing, we're going to leave with nothing. So,
I can balance that with the idea that I need
laziness? Yeah.
I need a job, I need to have a house, I need to do something, do that.
Yeah.
Get ahead,
We'll talk about that. We'll go through some of these things and then we'll talk about that. Okay? So the first thing is, remember, you came with nothing, you're going to leave with nothing. So it's one of the reasons why you need to be content and accept what has been given to you. It needs humility to accept that. Number two is, there's a promise in the Bible where God is going to look after everything. That's why you should be content. And it needs a level of humility to trust in God that He's going to provide for me and to follow this promise. For example, in Hebrews it says, "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.'" So God has promised, I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to leave you with, you're not going to be, if you're discontented and frustrated and you don't have enough in any aspect of your life, I'm going to look after you. So trust in me, be content, be settled, accept it, accept your realities. So that Number two is God is going to look after you. Trust in that promise that He's going to look after you, so we can learn to accept. The other thing is that throughout your life, you are going to go through ups and downs, right? We said in the workshop, this guy's busy, he's studying, he needs money, he's whatever. He's going through this period of life which is a bit of a struggle for him. There's going to be other parts in your life where things are going really well for you. And as this happens, you have to learn to be happy always. You have to learn to be content always. Because it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And if you learn only to be content when things are here, and always be discontented when things are here, you will forever be unhappy. And so St. Paul says, I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Everyone loves the last part. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Right? Everyone loves that part. Yes, do all things. But remember what St. Paul is saying. He's saying, I know now how to have nothing and to have everything. I know how to be in prison and be happy and content. I know how to be really rich and have plenty of money and have a nice comfortable house. I know how to have good friends and I have bad friends. I know how to have good kids and I have bad kids. I know how to have. Because what he's teaching, and by the way, it's a deep level of humility to understand and accept that. The good and the bad, the good and the bad. And in all cases, happy, joyful, content. In all cases. Because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Because God is the strength of it. That's the important part. It's not that I can just do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I've learned how to be content in all situations. And finally, from the Proverbs it says, better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Okay? So better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. And so part of the reason why we have to always be contented in what we have is because we need to learn the lesson that virtue is far more important than anything else. Virtue is far more important than having what you want. It's much better that you are generous than that you have a wonderful job paying you high money. It's much better that you're forgiving than that you have people treating you nicely. And that's so important. It's better. Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. So it's so important to be content. It's so important to accept the realities that God has given us. So I'll reiterate them. Number one is you came with nothing, you're going to leave with nothing. So remember that anything you have in between is kind of irrelevant. So be content with what you have. Number two is because God has promised He's going to look after you. So you can trust in Him. Number three is because you will go through goods and bads and ups and downs, and you have to learn how to be content in all of those situations, because Christ is the one who strengthens you. And remember that virtue is far more important than your circumstance. The inner life is far more important than your circumstance. So then that leads us back to Chris's question, which is this idea that, well then how does that then translate into, like how do you not get lazy, you know? Like if I'm meant to be content with whatever I have, why should I take any action in anything? You know what I mean? I just got to accept my reality as I am. And it's not about, it's important that this doesn't translate to laziness. Part of what God has given you, by the way, is work ethic. Part of what He's given you a brain, He's given you thoughts, He's given you energy. And so part of what He's given you is I use that energy, I use my brain, I use my thoughts, I use my imagination to improve the situation of myself and my family and the people around me. And I do that. But I'm quite happy with whatever outcome comes at the end of that, as long as I'm doing what I can in front of God.
So, I'm sure this relates to, they say, I've been listening to lots of leadership stuff, I don't know so much more, but it's very complex, it's unified that very attractive traits being ambitious and respect to other people. Other people say, oh, it's quite ambitious, the
guess there's two ways to answer that question. Okay? So ambitious and demanding respect, that's what people like. Okay? I disagree. Right? I disagree to an extent. Why? You'll find it depends how they demand their respect, by the way. So some people demand respect by their nature, demand respect by their hard work, by their integrity, by their, if in spiritual terms, by their godliness. So therefore, they do demand my respect, but without actually demanding it. They're not demanding anything, they're asking for nothing. But they walk into the room. If you think about some holy people, like in my experience was someone like Abuna Tarusmati, the guy walks into the room demanding respect. He is actually incredibly humble. He's quiet, he'll see, he doesn't want to disturb anyone. But immediately everyone stops. Pope Carlos was the same. Pope Shenouda was the same. Pope Tuadros is the same. So demanding respect, yes, people like people who demand respect, but they're not going around and shouting out and asking people to respect me. It's the opposite. People hate people like that. People hate people like that demand respect in that way. It's people demand respect by their nature. And their nature is the internal virtue that they're building is being expressed. So people have no choice but to honor them. You even think about someone like Pope Carlos with, I think Nasser was the president at the time. You probably know. At the time, Gamal Abdel Nasser feared Pope Carlos. Feared him. Not because Pope Carlos did anything to him. He was just a bishop, had no army, no nothing. He had no money, nothing. But he prayed for his children and he healed them. So he knew that the man was holy. So he feared him. He respected him. So that style of man, yes. Ambitious, I guess people like ambition. I don't fully understand that, but ambitious in the sense that they want to improve themselves or the world. And there's no better way to do that than through the spiritual life. And in that sense, yes, someone who's driven and working hard to improve, sure that demands respect. Sure that's likable. But not in the sense that I just want to beat everyone, be on top of everyone. And again, people don't like that style of person at all. And they'll never be chosen but as leaders. Those kind of people will never be chosen as leaders, particularly by God. And that was the next thing I wanted to talk about, is this idea that God will always choose his leaders from amongst the most humble. Amongst the most humble, he'll always choose his leaders. That's why Moses became such a big leader, even though he couldn't even speak. Because he was the most humble. And you know, it's not just in the spiritual life. I actually read a whole bunch of stuff outside. They did lots of studies on who make the best leaders, and it always came out to be the humble people. Because the humble people, they don't get offended easily. They accept criticism so they can improve. They can improve the business, they can improve themselves. They delegate to people who are better than them at something. They don't just assume that they're the best at everything. They know that other people are better than them at things, so they can delegate. They are teachable, you know, so they can improve. There's so many characteristics in a humble person, and that is the kind of person that God will work with. God will always make them his leaders. He will never choose people that are proud. By the way, you think about someone like Saul in the Old Testament, he was chosen initially for his humility. He was chosen initially for his humility, not because he was big and tall and had a thick head of hair and, you know, they say he was good looking and all these things. People chose him for that, but God chose him for his humility. But just because he was chosen for his humility doesn't mean that he was consistently accepted by God, because eventually he lost his humility. And when he lost it and he started to act in a different way, then he was rejected by God. So someone like Saul, so we can't just, I was humble, or I've accepted God has chosen me, and then I'm doing this kind of service, and then I consider myself, oh, God must have chosen me because of my humility, and then look what happens to Saul. So it's about the way I deal with him ongoing. Yeah.
Just out of demanding respect on the community part. Let's say you have, let's say you have a friend who always, let's say, swears at you or calls you a certain name. How are you supposed to be humble? Or like, what are you supposed to do in that situation?
He said, be content in all situations.
So you should still be the friend.
No, so we're talking about in the situation of abuse. No, so look, at the end of the day, you know, if we're being targeted or attacked, yes, you keep a distance, you be careful, you be cautious. And so yeah, you remove yourself from situations of abuse. Simple as that. Yeah, you can verbalize it. You can say no. That's. But I'm not aggressively defending my honor. I'm just trying to stop something that's pathological or not appropriate or not proper. Or as far as I'm capable. No, I don't have to tolerate abuse. No, that's not the point. The point is that I can tolerate humiliation. I can tolerate abuse. I can, if need be. And many times it will happen, and you know, defending yourself is not going to be appropriate. So I have to accept some things throughout my life. And so as much as possible, we tolerate, we accept, but yeah, you can remove yourself from situations of abuse. It's no problem there. And when you're confused, just talk to a confession partner. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions, guys? We're going to finish soon. I just thought to think of a couple of other things. So we said already that one of the things that happens if you are meek and humble and learn to be content in all that you have as one of the symbols of your humility, right? One of the ways that you express your humility is to learn to be contented in all that God has given you and all that you have. Then we already said that God will honor you. God will honor you, and He'll lift you up and He'll glorify you. He'll do it. You don't have to do it yourself. That's one of the reasons why, if you can, don't defend yourself. Defend others, but don't defend yourself. Why? Because God will honor you, God will defend you, God will care for you. You know, in the Proverbs it says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. By humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. It's a promise. It's a promise. You will be honored and looked after and cared for in a way that you can't understand. And like I said, this is the kind of people that God looks for to serve His people, to work through. When we say leaders of Christian people are people that God works through and helps to bring His kingdom into the world. The other thing is that if you are humble and you are contented in all that you have, the devil has no power over you. You know, it's a very important principle to understand that the devil has no power over humble people. You know, I gave that story right at the beginning of King Louis, and as he was hidden, he couldn't be seen by anyone, and so they couldn't attack him. Okay? When there's always this narrative that Christ, the devil didn't know who God was. Why? Because he couldn't comprehend the humility of God coming down in the form of a man and letting himself get treated that way. So he didn't know, are you the Son of God or not the Son of God? You know, in the story of Saint Anthony, he could see all of the temptations and problems in the world in front of him. And then he said to God, God, who is going to be able to escape all these problems? And then a voice comes from heaven and says, humility shall escape them. Humility shall escape them. You know, you think about all the problems that we deal with when we're young, the sexual mistakes, the pride, the friendships, the relationships, the gluttony, there's all sorts of mistakes that we're making day in, day out, the selfishness that we live through. And the only thing that's going to get you through it is humility. It's the only pathway through. Saint Macarius says, he has a vision from the devil. And the devil wants to attack Saint Macarius, and he's able to overcome St. Macarius in every way. Okay? And the one thing that stopped him from overcoming St. Macarius properly was the humility. Humility. It's always the same characteristic that comes up over and over and over again as the source of protection against sin, protection against the devil, protection against anything that comes your way. So remember that humility will protect you and look after you. Yeah.
So when you're saying humility can do all that, our humility to stand before God and say, I can't help me, you can? Is that what you mean?
No, not just that. It's everything. It's humility as a virtue in my heart. It's not, yes, a huge part of my humility is this moment that I stand in front of God. But it's no good that I try and stand in front of God in a moment and say, oh yes, I'm humble in front of you, God. I can't do anything except what you can do for me. And then I go outside and I'm discontented, as we said. I treat people terribly. I put myself first. I always defend my honor and dignity. So it's about the inner life. It's the inner virtue.
St. Anthony, for example.
Oh yeah.
In St. Anthony's situation and St. Macarius and conquering the demons and all that was ahead of him. When God said to him, or the voice said to him, only humility can conquer these. How? Because
so the reason why we are not at the whim of the devil when we are humble is because when you are proud, you are an easy target. When we defend ourselves, for example, when we put ourselves first, we become a very easy target. It's very easy for the devil to make us fall. Very easy, because all I'm thinking about is me. It's all I'm thinking about. It's me. And the second I start thinking about me, I'm going to fall into one of a series of sins. I will love money. I'll fall into sexual mistakes. I'll fall into pride. I'll fall into despair. I'll fall into discontentment. I'll fall into all these things because I'm at the whim of the devil. When I'm humble, yes, it's not me necessarily achieving this, but I'm no longer at the whim of the devil, and I call on the support of God. God will always defend the meek, the humble. He will immediately come to my aid. He will not allow me to fall. He will stand me up. And so the reason why is saying, who can? Even if I don't fall into this sin, I'm going to fall into that sin. That's what St. Anthony is saying. Who can? I can withstand it this long, but I can't withstand it forever. And he's saying, no, if you are humble, if you are meek, no, you can withstand because I will support you. That's the idea. I will support you. God cannot support those who are not humble. He can't work with them. That's the idea. I've read this to you before, and we'll finish with this. Mother Teresa gives a really lovely set of practical tips and tricks for humility. I think I've said it to you guys a number of times before, but I'll read them to you again. So this is what she says. These are a few of the ways we can practice humility. To speak as little as possible of oneself. Talking less of yourself will make you hopefully think less of yourself. So speak of yourself less. Okay? Talk about yourselves less. In conversation, this is just a practical advice. In conversation, talk about yourselves less. Because that will make you think about yourselves less. It's to make you start allowing yourself to think about God more. Think about others more. That's the idea. Number 2, to mind one's own business. So mind your own business. Don't put yourself in other people's business. Yeah.
When you say to talk about yourself less, how does that apply to, say, you were having a conversation, you're trying to have a catch up about your day? Is that separate or?
No, look, yeah, I mean, day to day in family life, and we're going to talk about our day. We're going to think about, we're going to share. We're sharing with the people that we love. Of course, that's okay. It's normal. But we're not insisting that everything is about me. That all we do is talk about my wants, needs. I'm just not fully focused on myself. In fact, it's far better, even in that family context, is to be constantly asking about others. How was your day? How are you? How's it going? What's happening with you? Etc. Etc. Focus on others. Focus on God. Don't let it be focusing on me. By the way, it doesn't take that long to report about my day. How many things happen in my day that I need to talk about it for the next? No. I'm not saying like everyone's different and every dynamic is different and family is different. It's not what. But just practical advice is don't try not to talk about yourself too much. That's the idea. By the way, if you apply this and you think about how much you talk about yourself, you'll find it's endless. I can't stop thinking and talking about myself. And you realize actually it's pathological the way we talk about ourselves. So, of course, we can talk about ourselves a little bit, but she's saying be alert to the fact that we are a bit self-obsessed. And that leads to pride and not humility. Opposite. Leads us to discontent. The whole thing I was talking about was contentment as one of the signs of humility. When you're constantly talking about my needs, my wants, my situation, before I know, I'm very discontented with my situation. I become a victim and this is a disaster. So we talk about ourselves less. To mind one's own business, so don't put yourself in other people's business. She says not to want to manage other people's affairs. So don't be overly involved in other people's affairs. Don't try and control other people. Try and manage them. To avoid curiosity. To accept contradictions and correction cheerfully. So that answers Chris's question. So even if you're being kind of corrected, humiliated, not being spoken to very well, accept it cheerfully. Keep abusing, yeah. Maybe. We'll just try it, see how it goes. To pass over the mistakes of others. So not to dwell on the mistakes of other people. Focus on your own mistakes, not other people's mistakes. Again, this is similar to the other one. To accept insults and injuries. Again, similar to accept being slighted, forgotten and disliked. So it's not even being insulted. She says to accept being forgotten and disliked. And offended, she says, if you're insulted, to be kind and gentle even under provocation. So to learn to manage your reaction when people have offended you or you've been provoked. Even if there's a good reason for you to be cranky. She says, no, be kind and gentle. Never to stand on one's dignity. So never to stand on one's dignity. And finally, she says, to always choose the hardest path. So don't always choose the easiest pathway. Sometimes choose the harder pathway. So these are just some practical things she says. I think these are good practical advice for us to finish. Glory be to God forever. Amen. Thank you for listening to me, guys. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to make or add? Yeah, sure. You found it? Oh, can you text it on the group? Yeah. Okay, Chris will share it. Because mine has some comments in between. You can put it on the group chat with the same pause. Okay. Thank you for listening to me, guys.
Father Paul for starting off our series of the beauty of less. So this is part 1. We've got 3 more parts to go. And thank you everyone for coming nice and early this week. We start at 8 p.m. Hoping to finish around 9:30 every week. A few of the announcements. We're going to be sending out the live stream link with the youth meeting message now. So if anyone has been, people have been asking about the live stream link. So if anyone can't make it or for whatever reason, we'll be sending out that link so you can send to them as well. The Friday night extravaganza, so the games night is going to be on Friday the 6th of September. So if we can pop that into our calendars, that'll be good, just to make sure everyone's here. There's a combined Southwest Sector meeting on Thursday the 22nd of August. That's at St. Anthony and St. Paul's Church in Guildford. It's a Thursday night, so it's not the Friday night, so we'll still be having our own meeting the following night. And and that's going to be on becoming a man or woman after God's own heart. That's the topic, and Father Anthony Mansell will be giving that talk. So that's Thursday the 22nd of August. There's a poster. I believe it's already been shared, but we'll share it again throughout the week. And if you are planning on going, if you could please private message me. They've just asked for catering purposes. If anyone definitely knows they're going, just to let me know so we can kind of figure out and let them know how many of us will be going.